The desert didn't care that it was the 20th anniversary. It lay there under a late October sun, the color of old brass, quiet as a stage before a curtain lift, the wind scraping across prickly pear and ocotillo like a match struck against sandpaper. In a stucco duplex on Animas Street, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, a man sat in a bedroom no one had slept in for 22 years and tried to measure time by the dust on a windowsill. Daniel Rourke had done this ritual so often he could have charted it. He would unlock the place at noon. He would carry in the same groceries, coffee, a dozen eggs, a loaf of sourdough from the co-op 2 doors down. He would walk through the rooms like a tenant who had missed 10,000 due dates and still couldn't get evicted, straight to the far bedroom where his younger sister's life had been paused mid-sentence. He would stand and listen for the click of the past, as if memory were an old slide carousel and he could force it to advance to a frame that showed something he'd missed. Today the click came early. Mara's hiking boots still weighted by the closet, scuffed brown leather, frayed yellow laces. The left boot wore a stain the color of spilled tea. He had cleaned that stain twice after the funeral that wasn't a funeral, after the memorial potluck with paper plates and soggy corn pudding and polite, exhausted condolences. The stain never budged. Some things wouldn't be lifted. That was the lesson the desert taught if you lived long enough to hear it. He reached for the box on the dresser, the box he always opened last, and opened it first. The lid rasped against cardboard like a breath held too long. Field notebooks, composition books, a spiral-bound pad with a coil that had been tugged into a misshapen ellipse because Mara liked to fidget while she thought. Post-it flags, some pale as old leaves, marked places he could have recited. Gypsum roses, fragile as spun sugar, on one. Capitan Reef, think ancient coastline, on another. There was a thin, olive-drab notebook he'd never noticed because it had stuck to the bottom of the box, glued there by time and a sliver of melted candle wax. He pried it loose. The cover had a postage stamp abrasion where glue had torn paper. She had written her name in block letters inside the first page, and then underneath, in a smaller hand that suddenly punched the air from his lungs, in case found, return to T or C address, coffee reward. He laughed once, a dry little sound. That was her, always making a game of things that made other people grind their teeth. He sat on the edge of the bed. The quilted coverlet still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets their mother had favored, and started to read. The entries ran like a map of weeks, sketches of arroyos, fossil doodles, lists of rock samples with dates. And then October 27, the night before she vanished at Carlsbad Caverns, written in her midnight slanted hand, "Going with Dan tomorrow." He'll pretend he's bored, but he'll be looking everywhere because that's what he does. I heard it again today near the main trail, low rhythmic hum, not bats, not water, no air moving either, almost mechanical. Get another look at the transition zone near the big room. Older survey shows a small sealed fissure just before the widening. H11, I might be reading it wrong. Feels like a secret whisper in the rock, mustn't fall behind, mustn't. Self, you are not a raccoon. He read the paragraph twice. The hum seemed to pulse beneath the words, a phantom he could almost hear in his teeth. His thumb had gone white where he pinched the page. He forced his hand to relax, but the tremor stayed. A truck downshifted on Broadway, the sound crawling into the room like an afterthought. The air smelled like dry plaster in summer that didn't want to leave. He closed the notebook carefully, as if the act could unbreak a hinge in the past, and set it next to the boots. Mechanical, he said aloud. It felt wrong, saying anything living in a room that had been curated for 2 decades into a museum. But once the word was out, others came crowding. Machinery meant power. Power meant purpose. Purpose meant somebody wanted something and didn't want to get caught. The thought knocked against a sealed place in him like a pebble dropped into a well. His phone trilled, unknown number. He stared at the screen and let it ring until the sound died. Voicemail took it. He waited for the afterbuzz, the tiny vibration that said someone had stored a message in a machine in a different room miles away. It came. He didn't listen. Not yet. He stood and stepped to the window. The afternoon was folding into itself. A woman in a long denim skirt pushed a stroller toward the public pool. A kid on a BMX bike skimmed past the mailbox bank at the corner, back wheel skipping like a flat stone. The town baked under a sky so clean it looked scrubbed, and for a reckless second he hated it for being beautiful. His life had been held in place by a lie tidy enough to frame. He'd kept his part of the bargain, return every year, bring offerings to the shrine of what he hadn't known, and the lie had paid him back with decay disguised as ritual. Today, the bargain felt crooked. On the kitchen counter, his grocery bag slumped open like a deflated lung, and the carton of eggs sweated in the heat. He cracked two into a cast-iron skillet, didn't bother with butter, didn't bother with toast. The eggs seized and browned at the edges. He ate leaning on the counter, chewing without tasting, then set the plate in the sink. He turned on the faucet to rinse it and caught himself. The tap ran metallic and green here on bad days. Their father used to grumble about the pipes. Whole towns held together with duct tape and wishful thinking, he'd said once, and Mara had laughed so hard she snorted water. He swallowed that memory like a pill too big to swallow. He picked up the phone and opened the voicemail. A woman's voice, young, maybe mid-20s, came through, hesitant but clear. "Mr. Rourke, my name's Abby Sloan. I work at the Carlsbad Public Library. We've been inventorying some donated Bureau of Land Management documents, older survey maps, and I noticed your sister's name in a clippings file the other librarian gave me. This is probably weird, but I found a topo survey from the 70s. There's a note about a sealed fissure near the main trail. I thought you might want to see it. I'm here till 6. Sorry if this is intrusive. Just yeah. My number is," he didn't write it down, he didn't need to. He hit call back, heard a timid hello, and said, "I'll be there in 45. He was in his truck 5 minutes later. The Ford steering wheel burned his palms. He rolled down both windows and let the hot wind rip through the cab as he headed south out of truth or consequences, the radio off, the tires buzzing a long low note that sounded too much like what the notebook had called a hum. He'd planned to make his anniversary visit to Carlsbad tomorrow, walk the trail like a ghost, pressing his hands to the cold railings that had learned his fingerprints. But planning was just a polite word for delaying. He drove. Highway 285 unfolded like a sliced-open vein. The desert turned slowly from pale wheat to a bruised blue-gray as clouds gathered over the Guadalupe Mountains. His thoughts jumped tracks and returned to places he'd boarded up. The ranger's voice in the cave, "We'll do a quick head count before the elevator." The moment of fumbling confusion and then the ignition spark of panic. "Where's Mara?" The way the cave absorbed the shouting so nothing came back but his own breath, ragged and small. The way a man named Cameron Keating had rested a hand on his shoulder and said, "We'll find her," in a voice like braided rope. He passed a billboard for Keating Adventure Co. 20 miles out from town. 4 smiling 20-somethings in hard hats standing in a cave, helmets lit like halos. "Find your wild." He almost laughed again and tasted iron. By the time he hit the outskirts of Carlsbad, the sky had darkened into the kind of twilight that made neon look like a promise. The library's brick facade glowed weakly in it. He parked crooked and jogged across the lot. Inside, the air conditioner hummed so loud his skin prickled. A young woman with a black pixie cut and a cardigan that didn't belong to October looked up from behind a desk stacked with manila folders. "Abby?" he asked. She nodded and stood, as if uncertain whether to offer a hand or an apology. She chose neither. "Thanks for calling back. This might be nothing. People donate boxes of junk, and sometimes we get excited because it's not all junk." "Sometimes the junk's the good stuff," he said, her shoulders unknotted a little. "My mom says that about yard sales." She led him to a back table where a topo map had been weighted at the corners with shellacked agate paperweights. The paper was brittle, the kind of yellow that happens to things tucked between other things for a long time. The notations were in a technical hand, tidy and exact. "Here," Abby said and pointed to a pencil circle no larger than a dime. "Near the main route, before the big room widening. H11, unstable shale, seal 1981. He didn't breathe. The hunger that rose in him felt indecent. Where did this come from? A BLM office that moved buildings last year. The librarian who retired used to volunteer here and left a bunch of boxes on her way out. I was sorting. I saw your sister's file in the cabinet. I recognized the surname from our local history shelf. I mean, this town makes people part of its furniture. Did anyone else see this? He asked, too fast. She blinked. No, just me. Should someone else? He looked up. The anxiety on her face was real and unperformed. She had done a kind thing and was not yet sure it was kindness. He softened his voice. Thank you for calling. You did the right thing. Relief made her grin crooked. It seemed like something, people say. We searched everywhere, but sometimes everywhere has a footnote. He stared down at the circle. He could feel the old story cracking at the edges, the way paint on a hot windowsill will craze before it peels. The ranger had said the trail area was solid. The sheriff had said the same in his careful, paternal cadence. Solid rock. The words had lodged in Dan's head and calcified there, heavy as stalagmites. Now this, can I copy it? He asked. We can scan. The machine's cranky, but it gives us PDFs if you sweet-talk it. She nodded toward an aging flatbed scanner. He stayed until 6:15, watching the whir and flicker of the machine as if it could rearrange decades. He took the scan on a thumb drive and on impulse made a paper copy, which he folded and slid into his wallet like a talisman. When he turned back, Abby was regarding him with a look he'd come to recognize in people who'd grown up here. They wanted the story to be a story, not a wound. Can I ask something? She said. Sure. What do you do for work? You don't have to answer. It's just most people I meet who look at maps like that are grad students or retired spelunkers. Urban planner, he said. Denver, I look at blueprints mostly, figure out where the weight goes, where things will fail if you don't plan for what you don't see. Her eyes flicked once to the map. Seems like you're planning for something. I'm planning for not being lied to anymore. It came out more bitter than he intended. She flinched, then nodded like she knew what he meant, though she'd never met the particular geometry of his loss. When he stepped outside, dusk had settled like a shawl. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. Heard you're in town. Coffee, CK no signature, but it didn't need one. Cameron Keating did everything with a flourish, even omission. 22 years ago, he'd done handstands off picnic tables to make restless teenagers smile before they shuffled toward caves like they were going to a movie instead of a cathedral. Dan stared at the little gray bubble as if it might sprout teeth. He typed, erased, typed again, then pocketed the phone and walked to his truck. On the drive back up Canal to the motel he'd booked for one night, he passed the Adventure Company's new storefront, steel and glass, terrariums with succulents arranged like stage sets, people inside sipping nitrogen coffee, a wall of helmets lit like a boutique. He pulled into a space he told himself wasn't surveillance and watched. The reflections in the window made masks of the faces. The logo on the glass winked in a dive bar neon, KEATING Adventure Co. Find your wild. He imagined walking in, imagined the bell on the door, imagined him laying the topo copy on the polished wood counter and speaking in a voice that would make customers look up from their lattes. He imagined Cam's mouth making a sympathetic shape before he said, "You've misunderstood the map, friend. Let the past be the past." He imagined the sympathetic shape sliding off like a costume. He didn't go in. This wasn't a show. Not yet. He checked into the Desert Sun Motor Inn under his own name because he'd never learned how to be anyone else, and because hiding would have felt like an accusation he wasn't ready to level. The room smelled of bleach and someone else's cigarettes. He set his bag on the single chair, the kind with a bolster that presses a ridge into your spine when you sit too long, and turned on the TV for noise. A baseball game hissed in the background, bodies tilting in unison under impossible lights. He spread the map and the notebook on the bedspread. The bedspread had a pattern he remembered from some other motel in some other year. He remembered standing over it with a different map, and the memory doubled back on itself until he was dizzy. He knelt and traced the trail in pencil on a copy he'd made in the library: Devil's Spring, Whale's Mouth, the narrowing before the big room, and then he tapped the pencil on the dime-sized circle until a dot bloomed like a bruise. He could hear Mara's voice in his head, clear, impatient, laughing at his caution. "Just look, Dan, the world tells you what it's made of if you put your ear to it." He used to joke that she could hear Rourke's gossip. He had learned later that what he envied most was her talent for believing the world would reward attention with wonder, not harm. He lay back flat, the ceiling stippled like a storm that hadn't made up its mind, and closed his eyes. He saw the cave again. Saw the tourists in their windbreakers and souvenir caps, the older woman who pressed a paper napkin to her nose and whispered, "I didn't know it would smell like this," as if underground had a moral smell. Saw Mara take 3 quick steps to catch up after pausing to peer at the limestone where water had made curtains thin as sugar glass. Saw the ranger's head turn for the head count in the moment, the half-breath, when Daniel had looked over his shoulder and not found his sister at his shoulder as he always had, since they were kids and he'd led her across a creek by stepping on flat stones first. He saw the space where she should have been. Absence has a shape. It had sat down in his life and never gotten up. He opened his eyes. The room hummed faintly. Refrigerators know how to imitate a heart. He sat, picked up the phone, and did the thing he'd not done all these years because some dumb loyalty to the past had kept him in a polite holding pattern. He found the number for retired Sheriff Warren Dole in a directory that still listed his address as a ranch house off a gravel road south of town. He hit call. It rang, and then Dole's voice machine said, "Leave it." Daniel left it. "This is Daniel Rourke. I'm in Carlsbad. I'd like to talk about a specific survey notated H11. I'll stop by in the morning." He hung up. The baseball game went to commercial. A truck ad promised redemption with a warranty. He turned the TV off and the room went so quiet his ears made their own insects. He went to the sink with his toothbrush and watched himself in the mirror as if the glass were a second opinion. He looked like the men he had grown up watching at church suppers, 30 pounds heavier than they wanted to be, eyes gone a shade lighter with worry, hair trying to go silver without calling attention to itself. He wasn't a detective. He was a man who knew how to read maps and the way buildings held their threats behind walls. But the feeling rising in him now didn't care about job descriptions. He spat, rinsed, dried his face on the rough towel and returned to the bed. He gathered the notebook and the map and slid them into his backpack with a deliberate, almost ceremonial care. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and laced his shoes tight, an old habit from pickup basketball with guys who taught 6th grade and stocked shelves at Walmart and could still cut on a dime if their knees allowed it. He wasn't going anywhere, not tonight, but lacing his shoes felt like getting ready to move through a world that had finally, after 2 decades, given him permission to move. At midnight the wind came up. It rattled the aluminum edge of the motel window and set the parking lot flag to cracking like a starter pistol. He lay awake and listened. Somewhere in the room's bones, a duct, a coil, a motor, something hummed. It wasn't much, just a low, patient sound like distance grinding its teeth. He thought of the map's dime-sized circle. He thought of a girl he'd loved more than he'd been able to say at 22, who had written "mustn't" in a notebook and then stepped into a space that had never been on any tourist brochure. He thought of a man with a smile built to sell courage, and another with a badge built to sell conclusions. He thought without flinching of the moment a story can't hold its shape any longer and mud starts to slide. The desert didn't care it was the anniversary, but Daniel did. He stared into the dark until the hum in his heartbeat took turns. Tomorrow he would knock on a door with the name Dole stenciled on the mailbox. Tomorrow he would walk into a glass front office where a logo told him to find his wild and lay a map on a desk like a summons. Tomorrow the past could run if it wanted to. He was done being the polite man who let it. Tonight he lay in a cheap bed in a town that had taught him how long a lie could sit without rotting, and he rehearsed the only promise worth making: no more sealed places. By 9 a.m. the October light had sharpened into something that made edges honest. Daniel followed a gravel road past a wind-worn mailbox stenciled Dole and a rusted sign that used to say "No soliciting," but had lost the N and the I. The ranch house hunkered low under a mesquite that had outlived 3 roofs. Plastic sunflowers in a cracked blue pot attempted cheer. A dog's bark, one of those hoarse, old man barks, broke the quiet, then faded like a cough swallowed on Sunday. He parked, killed the engine, and listened to the way the house held its breath. He had not slept much, and the shortness made everything bright and brittle. He knocked. It took time, the long kind that lets you reconsider decisions. Then the door opened on a rectangle of dim air conditioning and the sweet medicinal tang of menthol rub. Retired Sheriff Warren Dole looked smaller than he did in Daniel's memory, but more dangerous for it, lined, the jaw still set like a rule. A green oxygen tube marched across his upper lip into his nostrils and disappeared behind one ear. "Mr. Rourke," Dole said, flat as a receipt. "You found me, you didn't answer your phone," Daniel said, surprised at how civil his voice sounded. "Don't always feel like it." Dole stepped aside. "You can come in, shoes on, we're not fussy." The living room was a museum to certainty. Framed commendations, a shadow box with a tarnished badge, the photo of a line of deputies in 8-point hats under a sky that looked like it would behave if asked nicely. A glass front cabinet held a trio of ceramic eagles, an A38 revolver in a walnut case, brass plate engraved, "For 30 years of service." On the TV, a morning show scrolled headlines about a stock dip and a wildfire in Arizona. "Coffee?" Dole asked, already reaching for a Mr. Coffee that had seen as many sunrises as some marriages. "No, thanks." Daniel stood at the edge of a rug that had been vacuumed into straight lines. His palms had gone damp. He wiped them on his jeans. "You said you wanted to talk about a survey." Dole poured coffee for himself in a stained mug with a Cracker Barrel logo. "You know, men our age usually want to talk about golf. I saw a 1970s topo." Daniel kept his tone flat. BLM marked a sealed fissure near the main trail H11. Seal 1981. Dole sipped and made a face like the coffee owed him money. "Ah, that location is where my sister noted hearing a mechanical hum." Night before the tour. "Field notebooks," Dole said, and set the mug down with care as if the table were his last friend. "They're dreams that wear corduroy jackets. You ever run across an old love letter? Reads like truth because it's in your handwriting, still a letter." She was specific, Sheriff. "Retired," he corrected gently. 20 years retired. Then, speaking as a citizen who was once paid to find answers, Daniel pulled the folded copy from his wallet and laid it on the coffee table between a stack of TV guides and a church bulletin yellowed at the corners. "Did you know about H11? Dole didn't touch the paper. His eyes didn't move much, either. He breathed through the green tubing and watched Daniel the way men watch a traffic stop, hands visible, easy. "We had maps," he said finally. "Lots, most of them more useful to grad students than to lawmen. The area around the main trail is solid. You said that in 03 to my parents. It was true then," Dole said with a touch of the patient teacher. "Still is." "Then this is a forgery." Daniel tapped the dime-sized circle. The steadiness in his own hand surprised him. "It's a note," Dole said. "Probably for maintenance. There's always falling rock, little hazards tourists shouldn't twist ankles on. Rangers patch, seal, reroute. Don't make it a conspiracy because survey guys use pencils. Seal 1981 isn't a twisted ankle." Dole's mouth made a sympathetic shape that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Rourke, I know this time of year turns you inside out. You come down, you stir the ashes, but there's a difference between grief and excavation." He nodded at the folded paper. "You dig too deep in old paperwork, you find ghosts you put there yourself." A screen door creaked somewhere in the back of the house. A woman's voice called, "Warren, you need your inhaler." "I'm fine, Rita," Dole said without looking away from Daniel. The dog shuffled in, a geriatric healer with a cloud over one eye, and inspected Daniel's shoes like a TSA agent before sighing and lowering himself onto the cool tile. "My question's simple," Daniel said. His throat was dry. He swallowed. Did anyone search a sealed fissure near the main trail after my sister went missing? We searched everywhere we needed to. Dole's voice stayed gentle, a medicine that dulled edges, and we searched for weeks. We brought in dogs, we coordinated with the park service. We followed leads that had you in El Paso one day and Alamogordo the next because folks call and say they saw a girl who might be your sister at a gas station near a Dairy Queen. He lifted his cup, found it empty, set it down again. Son, this county has canyons you can lose a cattle drive in. There's more country under the ground than there is above it. We used the best judgment we had. Sometimes that isn't enough, I'm sorry. Daniel's jaw ached. Sorry was a rag he'd had shoved into his mouth for 2 decades. Did you know Cameron Keating co-owned a resource extraction company with you in the late 90s? The oxygen tube clicked softly when Dole took a breath. Careful, he said, the gentleness noiselessly removing its gloves. You toss a man's name and mine in the same sentence like that, you're building fences you don't want to pay for. I had investments, so did half the men in Eddy County. Oil, gypsum, survey outfits that lasted about as long as a dove season and paid about as well. You want to see my taxes, bring a subpoena. You want to make accusations, bring a lawyer. I asked a question. And I gave you the only answer that matters. We worked the case hard. I carried it home with me. Ask Rita how many nights she watched me sit in that chair. He jerked his chin toward a recliner furred with dog hair and go back over lists. You want to hold somebody accountable for the size of a cave, talk to God. The room seemed to tilt. Daniel felt the old reflex kick in, the one that made him apologize for making people uncomfortable, the one that made him shrink himself so authority didn't have to move its elbows. He made himself stand still. Sheriff, he said, if there was a sealed entry point near the main trail, if, Dole repeated softly, as if explaining a grammar lesson. You could spend your whole life in that word. Something in Daniel's chest flexed hard, then settled. You'll be hearing from me again, he said, and was surprised to find that he meant it not as a threat but as a weather report. At the door, Dole said, Mr. Rourke. Daniel turned. You were a good son to your folks. They believed the best of people. Don't throw that away because a piece of paper says seal. Paper says all kinds of things. He eyed the oxygen tube, pinched it with 2 fingers as if testing its truth. Breath's breath, paper's paper. Sometimes paper saves lives, Daniel said. Blueprints do. Sometimes they pour foundations in the wrong place, Dole said, and shut the conversation with a thin smile. The sun hit him like a shove when he stepped outside. The dog watched from the cool shadow, unimpressed by anyone's righteousness. Daniel crossed the yard, past the plastic sunflowers staging a cheer they couldn't back up, and felt the anger go cold and technical. This was how he solved problems at work when a developer swore a garage would fit where math said it wouldn't. You didn't argue with the man who liked his answer. You found a survey pin and let Steele talk. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered without checking. Rourke, Dan, Cameron Keating said, the voice unchanged, agreeable as a hardware store clerk. Heard you were in town. Thought I'd save you the trouble of stalking my storefront like a pie on cable. Coffee, or are we past coffee? We're not past anything, Daniel said. 10 minutes, I'll come to you. Always liked that Denver decisiveness, Cam said. See you at the shop. I'll tell Emma to hold the good cups. The line clicked dead. For a second, Daniel saw Mara's face, bright, exasperated. You're going to talk to him alone. And he heard himself answer in the way he'd learned to think since the map. I need to see the lie in his eyes. He drove to town with the map copy burning a precise square in his back pocket. The storefront door chimed as he entered, the sound too cheerful for the way his pulse logged seconds. Cool air and citrus cleaner. Walls dressed in climbing gear like a promise. A blonde woman behind the espresso machine smiled, the curated kind. Can I get you, Daniel? Cam shouldered through a glass door, arms wide. He looked like the man on the billboard had kept his appointment with time on friendly terms, salt at the temples, crow's feet that said sun and laughter in equal parts. He hugged, a quick clasp that smelled faintly of cedar soap, then held Daniel at arm's length. Hell, it's good to see you. Every October I think about you and Mara. Daniel didn't return the smile. Let's talk somewhere quiet. Cam's eyes flicked one beat too long to the espresso woman, then back. "Conference room," he said lightly. "Emma, 2 coffees, the good cups." He led Daniel into a glass-walled room with a slab table and a whiteboard where someone had sketched a canyon like a math problem. The door shut with a soft gasp. "So," Cam said, settling into a chair, easy as water. "What can I do for you, friend?" Daniel laid the topo copy on the table between them. He watched Cam's face, not the paper. Cam let his eyes drop. He didn't blink at the circle. He smiled instead, small and confident, and said, "Old maps are like old stories. They're mostly about the men who drew them." "I asked the retired sheriff a simple question," Daniel said. "He gave me a sermon." Cam leaned back, laced his fingers behind his head, looked up through the glass at the showroom where helmets glowed like planets. "That sounds like Warren. I think you both missed something near the main trail," Daniel said. Cam brought his gaze back down without the usual sparkle. "I think Grief's a lousy cartographer," he said, still smiling. "And if we're going to keep talking, I think you should be real clear about where you're heading with this, Dan." He tapped the paper lightly, like a man testing a fence, "because that circle won't hold you if you try to stand on it." Cam's smile stayed where it was, but the rest of his face tightened, like a bedsheet pulled smooth to hide a lump underneath. "That circle won't hold you if you try to stand on it," he said. "You'll twist an ankle." Daniel kept his voice even. "You were the lead guide, you ran the head count. You told my parents the trail area was solid. This says sealed fissure 15 yards before the big room." "Old maintenance," Cam said, dismissive and bright. "Every cave in America has 1,000 pencil notes. Seal here, fill there. Turn an ankle on a Tuesday, file a report on a Wednesday. We're not talking Stargate." "Seal 1981, Daniel repeated. Cam's gaze didn't follow the words. It stayed on Daniel, assessing the way a batter reads the pitcher, not the ball. He laced his fingers over his stomach and said, "You want a tour this afternoon? I'll comp it. Show you what solid looks like with your own 2 eyes." The offer dropped between them like a mic. "You think I'm a tourist," Daniel said. "I think you're a man who keeps coming back on the same week every year to sit in the same rooms and look at the same 2 photographs." Cam's tone was kind, almost fatherly. "Sometimes new light helps. You wouldn't believe what LED does to the big room. It's like God's dental work." Daniel didn't smile. "I don't need new light, I need the truth." "Truth is thick," Cam said, cheerful as the owner of a hardware store selling rope by the foot. "Folks like it thin. This circle of yours," he tapped the paper, "it's thin truth. Tastes good because it goes down easy, but it won't keep." The glass door whispered as Emma came in with 2 coffee mugs that really were nicer than the disposable kind, white, heavy, the kind that say you belong somewhere. She set one in front of each man and lingered a second, taking in the paper between them. "You boys good?" she asked. "We're wonderful," Cam said. "Thank you." The door shut again and the hum of the espresso machine came back on like a stage whisper. "Look," Cam said, leaning forward, shifting from pastoral to practical. "I keep my head above water because I've learned to separate grief from geology. It's not everyone's gift. You want maps, I know maps. I know the rangers who keep the real ones, not the photocopied junk that floats through the library when the BLM cleans house. You want to see them? We can take a drive, shake hands with the chief ranger, ask her what the trail looked like in '81. I'll stand right there and take my lumps if she says, 'Oh hell yes, we sealed a chasm the size of an F-150 and then forgot to mention it in 3. "And if she says there was a seal?" Daniel asked. Cam's smile decided to experiment with honesty. "Then I say, we seal little things all the time so a lady from Ohio doesn't go home with a broken tibia. That the kind of victory you're after." "Victory," Daniel said, "looks like the truth being the only story left." Cam tilted his head. For the first time the sail's pitch dimmed. "You think I have something to be afraid of," he said softly. "I think men who are afraid talk in absolutes," Daniel answered, and he heard Mara in his ears. "Stop apologizing, Dan. It makes thieves brave." A knock on the glass made them both look. A big-shouldered man with a silver goatee peered in, tapped the door with 2 fingers, and slid it open a foot. "Cam, that delivery from Albuquerque. Give me $10, Cam said without looking away from Daniel. "Stack it by the back cooler." Buck, his name stitched on his work shirt, took in the scene with a contractor's efficiency, nodded once and vanished. The door side shut. Cam exhaled through his nose. You brought Warren into this. I made a courtesy call, Daniel said. He told me paper is paper. Sounds like Warren, Cam said again, but there was a burr under his voice now. You understand the difference between a man who remembers what happened and a man who remembers how he wants to look for having been there. And which one are you? Cam spread his hands. The one still here. The one who has to answer when a school group asks, is this where that girl disappeared? The one who goes to Rotary breakfasts and church barbecues and tells folks to keep coming. The caves are safe because they are. And they are, Dan. We're not a horror movie. We're a park with a good safety record because people like me give a damn. You gave a damn in 2003, Daniel said. His own calm startled him. You stood at my mother's kitchen table and wrote your cell number on the back of a church directory and told her to call you anytime. And she did, when she couldn't sleep, when the newspaper got the date wrong, when a crank called from El Paso saying he'd seen Mara get in a blue pickup. You took those calls. You were a hero, I remember that. The compliment hung in the room uncomfortably. Cam looked away first. We all did what we could. Daniel nudged the topo copy 2 inches closer to the center of the table. I'm asking you to do it again. Cam stared down finally, eyes flitting across the penciled circle. When he looked up, the salesman had gone and something else, tired, maybe, or cornered, stood in his place. Since you want blunt, he said, let me return the favor. You climb in my store window with this, start whispering to the wrong ear about sealed fissures and mechanical hums. My bookings drop 20% by Thanksgiving. I lay off Buck. Emma starts looking for work in El Paso. My hero guide days don't pay the mortgage anymore. My business is my name, Dan. You smear my name with a ghost map and you'll get sued so fast you'll think the sheriff's still on my speed dial. Daniel felt the old instinct to back up. He didn't. You worried because you know what I know, he said very quietly. That circle might be thin truth, but it's a thin cut in a big story you've rehearsed down to the last sympathetic shrug. Maybe it all was maintenance. Maybe Mara misread a survey, maybe I'm the guy who can't move on, but someone wrote seal there. Someone heard a hum, and if I find one more someone, your absolutes start to look like strategy. Cam's jaw worked once. Outside the glass, a kid in a flat-brim hat tried on a helmet and struck a pose for his girlfriend. Inside the room, the air got crowded. Okay, Cam said finally, palms up, conciliatory. Okay, you want specifics. You want the exact foot-pounds of torque it takes to anchor a guard chain into limestone. You want the maintenance log from 81 that says Ranger so-and-so filled a hand-sized pocket with grout. I can probably find you that, but you want to drag my name through gravel in the meantime, don't. I haven't said your name to anyone, Daniel said. You texted me first. Cam blinked and looked for a second like he'd surprised himself. I heard you were in town, he said. Small town, phones still work here. Who called you? Cam chuckled without mirth. Dan, this place gossips at the speed of heat. You checked into the Desert Sun under your own name. Abby Sloan at the library, sweet kid, not great with secrets. She called me once last year to ask if we loaned headlamps. Told me her cat's name before she told me what she wanted. You think she called you and not me? Daniel felt the floor flinch under him the way an old pier boards shift when a wake hits. He hadn't considered that thread, Abby's nervous smile, the way she'd brightened when he thanked her. Had she called Cam to be helpful, to triangulate adults like a clever college kid, not to betray but to inform? Cam read his face and shook his head softly. Don't do that, he said. Don't turn a librarian into a villain because she acts like a small-town librarian. We're all in each other's business. That's how mercy happens most of the time. I don't need mercy, Daniel said. I need a way to stop the wrong story. Cam sipped his coffee, set it down carefully, then leaned in. Then here's a way, he said. 2 o'clock, I take you down myself, not on a group tour. We walk the path, and when you get to the spot your map says, you point, I show you what's there. If there's a patch you don't like the look of, I stand next to it and let you take all the photos you want. You go home and blow them up and tape them to your wall, and if you find a ghost in one, you call me and we go back and you show me where it's hiding. But you don't light a match in my lobby before you check if the stove is on. Understood. Daniel weighed the offer. Part of him whispered that going underground with this man was a bad idea. Another part, older, meaner, said that nothing changed from the surface. You had to put your ear to the stone. I'll be at the natural entrance at 2, he said. If you're late, I go without you. Cam's eyes narrowed the smallest degree. You go without me, you go home in handcuffs, he said. Don't do something dumb because you're tired of feeling civilized. I'm tired of feeling managed, Daniel said. Same disease, different doctor, Cam answered, and then he did that thing Daniel remembered him doing in 2003 when conversations started to skid. He smiled like an apology, stood up, and ended it by extending his hand. 2 o'clock, he said. Wear shoes you can trust. Daniel didn't take the hand. He left the coffee untouched and the topo copy on the table for Cam to stare at later and maybe fold, maybe tear, maybe pretend not to read again. In the showroom, Emma slid him a to-go cup anyway. Long day, she asked, friendly but not fishing. Long 20 years, he said, and stepped into the white-hot noon. On the sidewalk, he paused to look at the framed photographs along the front window, kids with hard hats, groomsmen doing a last adventure before the altar, 2 retirees beaming at stalactites like they were grandkids. In the middle, a photo he knew too well, a group at the mouth of the natural entrance, dated October 28, 2003. There was Mara, head turned, hair pinned to keep out the drip, her smile halfway built. There was Daniel behind her, looking down, already trying to plan a safe way through a world he didn't understand. And there, at the photo's edge, reflected faintly in the glass because someone had shot through a window, was a sheriff's cruiser parked where it shouldn't have been, a month before Dole had any reason to loiter. Daniel leaned closer. The cruiser's number glinted in the reflection, reversed but legible if you knew how to flip it in your head. He did. He took a picture with his phone. The photo caught his own face ghosted over Mara's, 2 men welded by light. At 2 o'clock, he would go down into the dark again. Before that, he had a number to call and a question for the county garage about who had the keys to that cruiser in October, and why. The Carlsbad Public Library was cooler than the street outside, but it carried the dry paper smell of a place that had been holding its breath for decades. Daniel walked past the front desk without stopping for the polite nod from the afternoon clerk and made straight for the local history section. If Cam Keating wanted to play the maintenance log game, Daniel was going to find every scrap of paper that proved there was more to that dime-sized circle than grout and good intentions. He started with the bound municipal records, weighty, cloth-covered volumes with peeling gold-leaf titles, Eddy County Board of Commissioners minutes, 1978-1983. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, the air conditioner clicked and groaned. Each page he turned was a door to a hallway that might lead nowhere. 3 hours in, he found a line item buried in a 1981 maintenance budget. Carlsbad Caverns, Trail Safety Project, Materials and Labor, $1,100. No description, no specifics. A number, a date, and a vague label. It was the sort of thing that passed without notice, unless you were looking for the seam. He photographed it with his phone, then moved on to geological surveys. The 1974 topo map Abby had shown him now felt like a starting gun. He wanted to know how many other times seal had been scribbled in pencil where the tourist brochures claimed solid rock. By late afternoon, his fingertips were gray with newsprint from the microfilm machine. The whir and click of its reels was the only sound in the room besides the occasional cough from the genealogy table. He scrolled through Carlsbad Current Argus archives, scanning headlines. Oil prices hit record high. Sheriff warns against trespassing in caverns. Local ranger receives safety award. And then October 1981, tucked under a community events section, BLM survey team works with local outfit on trail safety improvements. The article was barely 200 words, quoting a private geological contractor named Keating and Dole Surveying, LLC. The photo was grainy, but Daniel could make out a young Cameron Keating in a hard hat, standing beside a tall man in sheriff's khakis, Warren Dole in his prime. The caption mentioned addressing unstable formations near the main tourist route. The words hit like a slow-building migraine. Cam hadn't just known about H11, he'd been there when it was sealed. Daniel printed the article and slipped it into a manila folder. Research day, he turned. Abby Sloan was standing behind him, a stack of books in her arms. She wore a t-shirt with a print of a trilobite skeleton and had the tentative half-smile of someone who wanted to help but wasn't sure if help would be welcome. "Something like that," Daniel said, his voice lower than he meant. She glanced at the manila folder. "Find anything good? Maybe." He hesitated. "Abby, did you tell Cam I came by?" Her eyes widened, then softened into guilt. Yeah, I mentioned it when I called to ask about borrowing a field guide. I figured you were friends. You are." Daniel let the pause hang. "We were once. I'm sorry." She shifted the books in her arms, small-town reflex. "You hear a name, you pass it along, didn't think." She trailed off, searching his face. "Is this about your sister?" "It's always about my sister." Abby bit her lip. "I shouldn't say this, but if you're looking for more records, the BLM donated boxes when they moved offices last year. Most of it's sitting in storage, unprocessed. Technically, it's not public yet, but..." She lowered her voice. "The key's in the top drawer of the desk in the back office. It's marked stationary." Daniel studied her, trying to decide whether the sudden flutter in his chest was hope or the warning that came before a fall. "Why are you helping me?" "Because 20 years is too long for polite lies," she said simply, and left him standing there. The storage room smelled of cardboard and dust. Metal shelves lined under the weight of file boxes marked with masking tape in shaky handwriting. Maintenance logs 1979-84, survey notes Carlsbad. He found the one he wanted after 20 minutes, wedged between bat population studies and lighting upgrades. Inside, under a layer of brittle memos, was a stapled packet, Project Report, H11 Stabilization. The header bore the letterhead of Keating and Dole Surveying. The language was clinical. Fissure approximately 5x3, unstable shale, sealed with reinforced mortar, area camouflaged to match surrounding limestone. In the margins, in pencil, someone had scribbled, "Keep this off tourist maps." Daniel read it twice. His pulse thudded in his ears. This wasn't vague budget lines or ghostly topo circles. This was instruction. This was deliberate. Footsteps in the hall snapped his head up. He shoved the packet into his folder and pushed the box back into place just as the door opened. A man in a park ranger's uniform stepped in, filling the doorway. "You're not staff," he said, not unkindly but with the authority of someone used to compliance. "I was told I could check a file," Daniel said. The ranger's eyes flicked to the folder. "That file public will be," Daniel said. The ranger studied him for a beat, then shrugged. "Lock the door when you're done," he said, and walked out. Back in his truck, Daniel laid the photocopied report on the passenger seat. Keating and Dole had been in business together when the fissure was sealed. They had kept it off tourist maps, and Cam had looked him in the eye not 2 hours ago and called that map thin truth. The weight of it was both vindication and poison. Vindication because he wasn't chasing shadows. Poison because proof without context was just paper, and paper could be explained away. If he confronted Cam with this now, Cam would spin it into safety protocol, nothing more. If he waited, went deeper, found why the fissure had been sealed and what Mara had heard inside, maybe the truth would be too big to drown. He turned the ignition, the folder on the seat like a passenger who knew exactly how this drive would end. 2 o'clock at the natural entrance was still on the table. But now Daniel thought it wouldn't be Cam leading him through the dark, it would be him leading Cam to the place where the story broke. And when it broke, it wouldn't be polite. The Desert Sun's ice machine rattled like a car with a bad belt as Daniel filled 2 bottles for the road. He hadn't been back to the motel since leaving the library, but the air in the room felt different now, charged, like a storm was squatting just beyond the hills. The photocopied H11 Stabilization Project report lay spread across the bed, next to the 1974 topo map and Mara's field notebook. Together, they looked like evidence bags laid out in a courtroom exhibit. The problem was, in a courtroom, the other side would get to speak. Cam would stand there with his tan and his practiced smile and turn every keep this off tourist maps into the equivalent of covering up a pothole. He needed more, something physical, something the parks department couldn't dismiss as a precautionary seal, and that meant going into the fissure himself. Daniel wasn't reckless by nature. Urban planning taught you to see risk like an architect, load, weight, stress, how things fail. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he'd been living around this one weak point for 22 years, building every decision to keep from pressing on it. Now he was going to press. He started a list in the motel's yellow legal pad. Entry: natural entrance, less traffic, gate with chain and padlock would need to cut it. Gear: rope, harness, pry bar, lead headlamp with spare batteries, gloves, geological hammer in case he needed to chip away sealant, small crowbar, first aid kit, time, after hours, minimum ranger presence, moonless night in 2 days, good for cover, comms, cell coverage inside was unreliable. Might need a burner phone to call for help before going in. He stared at that last bullet. Calling for help in advance meant tipping someone off. But it also meant insurance. If he didn't walk back out, there'd be a record of where to start looking. At 5:30, he headed for the hardware store on Canal Street. The bell over the door jangled, and the cool air smelled of pine shavings and motor oil. "Can I help you find something?" The clerk was a wiry man with a silver ponytail and a name tag that read Vic. "Bolt cutter," Daniel said. "Something that'll handle a heavy chain." Vic raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. "Got a 24-inch here, solid jaws, good leverage. You cutting cattle panels or just tired of your own padlocks?" "Old gate on a family property," Daniel lied smoothly. "You'll want gloves too, chain'll bite if you're not careful." Vic set a pair on the counter, then looked him over. "You're not from here?" "No." Vic nodded like that explained everything. "Then here's a tip, those caverns, they've got eyes even at night." Daniel's head came up. "Meaning?" Vic shrugged, bagging the cutter. "Meaning you better be sure you're not trespassing somewhere folks are paid to guard. Around here, sometimes no entry means more than rocks falling on your head." It was meant as local wisdom, but it landed on Daniel like confirmation. Back at the motel, he called a number he'd memorized before coming to town, the NPS Law Enforcement Division in Santa Fe. A recorded menu clicked through options until he reached a voicemail box for anonymous tips. He kept it vague. Possible illegal activity at Carlsbad Caverns, location coordinates to follow. He read off the latitude and longitude from the topo map for H11. May be linked to unsolved disappearance 2003. Entering to document condition. I will be alone. His voice didn't shake until the last 4 words. At 7, he drove out past the edge of town, where the land flattened into scrub and the sky stretched so far it felt like it could peel you off the earth. He parked at a picnic area where the wind gnawed at the flag on a leaning pole, then opened Mara's notebook to the October 27 entry. He read the line again, feels like a secret whisper in the rock. He imagined her saying it, voice low, conspiratorial, excited. She wouldn't have been afraid, not then. That was the difference between them. She chased the strange. He designed around it. Now the only way forward was straight into it. His phone buzzed, unknown number. He almost let it ring, then answered. "Dan," Cam's voice warm as a campfire. "Change of plans, something came up, can't do 2 o'clock tomorrow. We'll reschedule." Daniel's grip tightened. "Not an option. Everything's an option," Cam said lightly. "I'm offering you a safe walkthrough with the guy who knows every inch of that trail. You can poke all the grout you want. Or you can play tourist on your own and end up explaining to a deputy why you're in a restricted section. Your call." Daniel's silence stretched. "You know what I think," Cam went on. "I think you're hoping to catch me in a lie. Problem is, there's nothing to catch, so maybe you go back to Denver, save yourself the trouble." Daniel pictured the H11 stabilization header, the margin note, "Keep this off tourist maps." He thought of Warren Dole's tight smile. "I'll see you there," he said. 2 o'clock, don't be late." He hung up before Cam could answer. In the quiet after, Daniel realized the conversation had given him something unexpected, proof that Cam didn't want him down there without supervision. That meant Cam believed there was still something worth controlling. 22 years later, it sharpened Daniel's plan into something more dangerous, more personal. Tomorrow's walkthrough would be his cover, but the real descent, the one into the sealed fissure, would happen at night without Cam's flashlight beam telling him where to look. He opened the bolt cutter's package, felt the weight of the jaws in his hands, and set it beside the rope coiled on the bed. The tools looked out of place in the small, clean motel room, like they belonged in a different story entirely. The thing was, by this time tomorrow, they would. By the time the park gates closed to tourists, Daniel was back in his truck, parked a mile up the road in a turnout where the headlights of passing cars couldn't touch him. The sun had dropped behind the Guadalupe Mountains, leaving a violet bruise across the horizon. He waited until full dark before shouldering the pack. The bolt cutter's weight pulled at him, a reminder that this wasn't a hike, this was a break-in. He hiked through scrub and mesquite until the paved trail to the natural entrance came into view, the faint glint of the gate's chain catching his headlamp beam. The gate was heavy iron, the kind that made a statement more than it stopped anyone determined. The padlock was thick and new, the chain was not. Daniel crouched, slipped the bolt cutter's jaws around the link, and pressed. The steel groaned, then snapped with a sharp clink that seemed to echo far too long. He froze, listening. The night was a still thing, only the far-off rustle of wind through Ocotillo. He slipped through the gate, pulling it shut behind him out of habit, as if stealth could still undo the cut chain. The air changed almost immediately, cooler, carrying the damp mineral scent of underground spaces. His boots scuffed on the worn concrete of the descending path. Shadows bent and swayed with the headlamp beam. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep that wasn't his. At Devil's Spring, he paused. The rock formations here were familiar from childhood field trips, twisted curtains of calcite, stalagmites rising like frozen fire. But under the beam they seemed closer, as if the cave itself was leaning in. The topo map and Mara's notebook lived in the side pocket of his pack. He didn't take them out, he didn't need to. He'd memorized the route. Past the whale's mouth, a gaping limestone arch that always looked to him like a giant midroor, then 30 yards to the left-hand wall before the trail widened into the big room. That wall looked unremarkable to a tourist. To him, it was an architectural disguise. He ran his hand along the rock, searching for the subtle wrongness he'd pictured for days now. There, a patch where the surface was rougher, the coloration just slightly off from the surrounding wall. An architect's eye saw it immediately, the joints too straight, the randomness too deliberate. This was the seal. He dropped his pack and took out the pry bar. The first push got him nothing but a metallic scrape. He tried a different angle, wedging into a hairline gap near the bottom. The stone shifted with a sound like a coffin lid under strain. Adrenaline punched through him. He leaned harder, grunting, the muscles in his shoulders screaming. Mortar cracked, a fist-sized chunk tumbled out, clattering onto the trail. He froze again, listening for the telltale scrape of boots on concrete that would mean he wasn't alone. Nothing. Daniel worked faster, the rhythm of pry-and pull filling the space. Dust coated his tongue, sweat burned his eyes. Finally, the gap was wide enough to squeeze through. The air beyond was stale, so old it seemed to have weight. He swung the headlamp's beam inside. The fissure had been widened into a narrow, man-made tunnel, descending at a shallow angle for 10 feet before opening into a chamber no bigger than a suburban living room. He crawled through, his jacket snagging on rough stone, and dropped into the space. The floor was covered in a layer of fine dust and rock chips. Against one wall sat a rusted generator, its fuel line rotted away. A tangle of electrical cords lay like dead snakes, leading to a section of rock that had been cut away with surgical precision. Daniel stepped closer. The cuts were clean, the kind you didn't get from amateur chipping. Someone had used professional-grade tools. Embedded in the exposed rock was a fossil perfectly preserved, the size of his hand. Its ridged carapace gleamed under the LED light. But it wasn't the fossil that made him stop breathing. Half buried in the silt near its base was something metallic. He knelt, brushed away the dirt, and felt the sharp edges of a small silver charm, crescent moon, tarnished but unmistakable. Mara's charm bracelet, the one she'd worn on every trip since their parents had given it to her for her 16th birthday. His throat tightened. The cave seemed to contract around him. Here in this hidden room, 22 years collapsed into a single point. This was where she'd been, where she'd died. The scrape of a shoe on stone jerked him upright. A beam of light flared from the tunnel entrance, blinding him. "I had a feeling you wouldn't let it go," a voice said, familiar enough to bring bile to his throat. Cam Keating stepped into the chamber, headlamp cutting white scars across the walls. He held a heavy maglite in one hand like a club. "You always were stubborn, Dan," he said, his voice low, almost regretful, just like her. Daniel's hand closed around the charm, the metal biting into his palm. "You left this here," he said. "You didn't even see it." Cam's eyes flicked to the charm, and for the first time his face cracked, panic flashing before the mask dropped back into place. "Tell me why," Daniel said, his voice shaking but loud enough to fill the chamber. Cam sighed, the sound of a man already weary of his own story. "It wasn't supposed to happen. We were almost done. One more haul and Miller and I were clear. She came back, slipped in when I was doing head count. Thought she'd found the discovery of the century. She wouldn't let it go. She fought me, tripped, hit her head on the generator." He gestured vaguely toward the rusted machine. "It was an accident, but accidents ruin lives if you let them. We sealed it, redirected the search, planted the backpack so there'd be doubt, worked like a charm." The maglite lifted slightly. "You can't leave here, Dan. I'm not going to prison for something that happened 22 years ago." Daniel's gaze darted to his pack 10 feet away, geological hammer lying beside it. "Too far." "They'll find my truck," Daniel said, forcing his voice steady. "They'll think you got lost," Cam countered, stepping forward. The light from the maglite swung closer, and Daniel's grip on the charm tightened. The cave felt smaller still, as if the walls were leaning in to watch. The maglite's beam slashed across Daniel's chest, bright enough to feel like heat. Cam advanced a step, his boots crunching over the layer of grit that had settled on this hidden floor for more than 2 decades. "You can't walk out of here, Dan," Cam said, voice low and deliberate. "You know too much now." Daniel kept his eyes locked on him, calculating angles, distance, and the sheer fact of Cam's size. The man was still as broad-shouldered as he'd been in the old photo from the paper, a frame built for caving gear and long days underground. In the confines of this chamber, there wasn't much room to maneuver and no margin for mistakes. "I didn't come here to die in a hole," Daniel said. "That's what she said in her own way," Cam replied. His tone was almost conversational, which made it worse. "She was excited, Dan, lit up like it was Christmas morning. Told me the university would lose its mind when they saw what we'd found. She didn't see the problem, because there wasn't a problem until you made one," Daniel shot back. Cam's jaw tightened. "She was going to ruin everything. One phone call to the wrong person, and Miller and I would have been stripped bare, licenses gone, every dime seized, federal charges. Do you have any idea what it's like to see your whole life ready to collapse because someone can't keep their mouth shut?" Daniel's voice was ice. "Yeah, I've been living that for 22 years. The maglite shifted in Cam's hand, tilting up just enough to shadow his eyes. She pushed me. I grabbed her arm just to stop her. She stumbled, head met steel. The sound," he shook his head, his voice going quieter. "You don't forget a sound like that." Daniel took a step toward him, keeping his voice steady even as his pulse hammered. "So you sealed her in here, buried her with the fossils, and you've been playing the hero guide ever since." "We didn't bury her," Cam said sharply, as if that small technicality mattered. "We moved her, sealed the site. Made sure nobody came sniffing around again. The backpack was my idea, give folks something to chew on, keep M from thinking about the cave." "You controlled the story," Daniel said, "and you're still trying to control it now." Cam's eyes hardened. "I told you, Dan, if you walk out of here, my life is over, and I'm not letting that happen." The maglite rose another inch. Daniel's gaze flicked toward his pack 10 feet away, the geological hammer lying just beyond it. too far to reach without giving Cam an opening. He needed a distraction. "You think Miller's going to keep your secret when the walls start closing in," Daniel said suddenly. "You think a man his age is ready to die in prison?" For the first time, something cracked in Cam's face, just a flicker, but enough. Daniel took the moment, dropped low, and lunged sideways toward the wall. His hand found a fist-sized rock, and he hurled it at the far side of the chamber. It hit with a crack that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. Cam's head whipped toward the sound. Daniel dove for the pack, sliding across the gritty floor. His fingers closed around the hammer's handle just as Cam turned back, charging. The first swing wasn't meant to hit, it was meant to keep Cam back. Daniel whipped the hammer up in a wide arc, forcing him to slow his approach. The second swing came from Cam, the maglite lashing out. It caught Daniel's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down his arm and nearly making him drop the hammer. They crashed together, the beam from Daniel's headlamp jerking wildly, painting the chamber in dizzying streaks of light and shadow. Cam's hands found Daniel's throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. Daniel clawed at his wrists, the pressure crushing, his vision dimming at the edges. He could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears. With the last of his air, he swung the hammer up, not at Cam, but at the generator behind him. The steel rang out with a deafening clang, the noise ricocheting through the chamber like a bell. Cam flinched just enough. Daniel twisted hard, breaking the chokehold, and shoved him backward. They both staggered, boots slipping in the dust. Cam recovered faster, lunging again. But before he could close the gap, a voice boomed from the tunnel entrance. "Federal agents, drop it, hands where we can see them." Daniel spun toward the light, three figures in tactical gear framed in the narrow opening, weapons raised, beams flooding the chamber. Cam froze, the maglite still in his hand. Then slowly he let it drop. The thud it made against the floor was the only sound besides Daniel's ragged breathing. One agent moved in, cuffing Cam with brisk efficiency. Another turned to Daniel. "Sir, you all right?" Daniel nodded, his voice rough. "I made a call before I came down. Anonymous tip, coordinates for H11. Told you there might be a cold case connected." The lead agent's eyes flicked to the fossil wall, then to the silver charm still clenched in Daniel's fist. "Looks like you were right." Daniel opened his palm, the charm glinting under the LED light. "This was my sister, S," he said quietly. The agent gave a small nod. "We'll take it from here." As they led Cam toward the tunnel, Daniel leaned against the wall, letting the cold limestone press into his back. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline ebbing, the weight of what he'd just pulled off settling over him. Mara's charm was still warm from his grip. For the first time in 22 years, he had more than a question, he had proof. And proof, he thought, was how you finally break a story wide open. The agents didn't waste time. Cam's wrists were locked in steel, his headlamp stripped away, the maglite bagged as evidence. They moved him toward the tunnel like they'd rehearsed it, each step deliberate on the uneven rock. Daniel followed in a daze, the silver charm clutched tight enough to cut half-moons into his skin. His breath echoed inside the helmet of his own headlamp. Every step out of the chamber felt heavier than the ones in. The adrenaline spike was fading, and in its place was the deep, quaking exhaustion of someone who had been holding his breath for 22 years. At the lip of the fissure, one agent looked back. "We'll bring you up in a minute, sir. We need to get him out first." Daniel nodded, leaning a hand against the cool stone wall. The scrape of Cam's boots against the limestone path above faded. He closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the LED light, the distant drip of water, until a voice broke through, low and bitter. "You think this fixes anything?" Cam's voice, ragged now, carried down from where the agents had paused. Daniel looked up. Cam was turned halfway toward him, shoulders squared despite the cuffs, eyes drilling into him with a kind of furious clarity. "You think you've saved her," Cam went on. "All you've done is trade one story for another. You're going to stand in court and they'll cut me up for the accident, sure, but they'll cut her too, make her out to be nosy, careless. They'll drag her down to keep me from sinking alone." The words hit like a gut punch. Daniel had imagined justice as clean truth placed in the sun, the shadow banished. But he knew enough about trials to picture the other version, defense attorneys picking apart Mara's last moments until she wasn't a sister, just a cautionary tale. "That's on you," Daniel said, his voice tight. Cam gave a humorless half-smile. "No, Dan, it'll be on you. You're the one who brought her here tonight." An agent shoved him forward, ending the exchange, but the barb stuck. When Daniel emerged into the open air, the desert night was vast and sharp. Stars punched into the black sky like holes in paper. A pair of black SUVs idled on the service road beyond the gate. More agents stood around them, their radios crackling. A woman in a windbreaker with the Department of the Interior seal approached, her dark hair pulled back tight. "Mr. Rourke, Special Agent Marisol Vega." Her handshake was firm, her eyes level. "You're the one who called in the tip." "Yes," Daniel said. "Anonymous number. I figured it would get buried if I used my name." Vega gave the smallest flicker of a smile. "Not a bad instinct. You picked a good trigger, specific coordinates, cold case reference. It got my supervisor's attention." She glanced toward the open gate. "We'll have to bring in a full recovery team for the site. We already photographed the fossil wall. You found the charm in there." Daniel opened his palm, showing the tarnished crescent moon. Even in the dim light, it caught a flash of silver. "She wore it every day," he said. Vega nodded. "We'll catalog it, but I can make sure it gets back to you when we're done." She studied his face for a moment. "You want to sit in on the first interview?" Daniel hesitated. "With him. Sometimes it's better to hear it all at once before the lawyers arrive," she said, "but it's your call." Part of him wanted to walk away, to let the professionals do the breaking. Another part, the one that had carried this wound like a second spine, knew he needed to hear every syllable with his own ears. "I'll stay," he said. They set up in the smaller of the two SUVs, Cam in the back seat, cuffed to a floor ring. Vega sat across from him, Daniel beside her. A recorder on the center console blinked red. Cam didn't look cowed. If anything, he looked relieved, as if the performance of hiding had been heavier than the crime. "State your name," Vega began. "Cameron Keating." "Mr. Keating, you understand you have the right to remain silent." Cam smiled faintly. "I've been told I talk too much." He glanced at Daniel. "Ask him. He's been watching me spin stories for decades." Vega's tone didn't shift. "Tell me about October 28th, 2003. Cam leaned back, the cuffs clinking. "It was an accident. I told him already." "Tell me," Vega repeated. So he did. The same beats Daniel had heard in the chamber, the stumble, the head hitting steel, the panic. But now he added details, sharp as glass. How Miller had been stationed at the entrance as lookout, how they'd already crated up 3 fossils bound for a collector in Dallas, how they'd chosen to seal H11 instead of risk discovery. Daniel kept his eyes on Cam S, searching for any flicker of regret. There was some, but it was tangled with something colder. "You know the worst part," Cam said suddenly, voice dropping. "She wasn't scared of me, not even then. She thought I was just trying to shoo her off, right up until she fell." Daniel's throat tightened. Vega's pen scratched across her notepad. "And the backpack, my idea," Cam said without hesitation. "People need a breadcrumb to follow, or they start making their own trails. I gave them one that went nowhere." The SUV was silent except for the hum of the engine. Daniel finally spoke. "You could have told the truth then. You could have given us her body." Cam's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. "And spent the rest of my life in prison. You think I'm noble, Dan. I'm not. I'm just a man who wanted to keep breathing." The agent hit the stop button on the recorder. "That's enough for now." She leaned toward Daniel as they stepped out. "You've got your confession. That's more than most families get." Daniel nodded, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the first step into a different kind of weight, the kind that didn't leave even when you knew the truth. As they loaded Cam into the second SUV, Vega turned to him. "Get some rest, Mr. Rourke. Tomorrow's going to be loud. Press will have your name by noon." He looked past her to where the desert stretched out under the stars. "It's been loud for 22 years, he said. Just nobody else could hear it." By the next morning, the headlines had already crawled across the bottom of national news channels. "Cold case solved after 22 years, former park guide, retired sheriff charged." The motel phone rang before Daniel had even finished the burnt coffee from the lobby pot. It was Special Agent Vega. "We picked up James Miller an hour ago," she said. "Found him at his ranch outside White City. He didn't resist, but he's already asking for a lawyer. Cam's confession put him right in the middle of the cover-up." Daniel pictured the old man from yesterday, oxygen tubing, sunken eyes, and tried to reconcile him with a man who'd calmly stood watch while Mara bled on a cave floor. "Are they going to trial?" Daniel asked. "If Miller fights, yes. Keating's attorney is already talking plea deal, manslaughter, obstruction, illegal excavation." With his age, Miller's looking at the rest of his life inside no matter what. Daniel let that settle, the way you let a stone drop in a pond and watch the ripples. Vega's voice softened. "We recovered remains from the chamber early this morning. I need you to come to the field office for a formal identification." The office was a converted strip mall storefront, the kind with beige carpet and stale air. In a small conference room, two evidence techs laid out a tray of sealed bags. Each was labeled and dated. A tarnished silver bracelet, links worn smooth except for the empty space where the crescent moon charm had once hung. A pair of hiking boots, laces frayed. A zippered fleece jacket, deep red, faded to brick. And finally, a photograph of a partial skull, fracture lines like lightning bolts across the bone. Daniel stared at the bracelet first. His chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. "That's hers," he said, voice low. "All of it." One tech nodded and began to reseal the items. "We'll transfer them to the coroner, then to you, once the court clears them." Vega studied him. "We can step outside if you want a minute." He shook his head. "No, just let's finish." She did, the paperwork precise and endless. Each signature felt like closing another door. 2 weeks later, Cam stood in court wearing a county jumpsuit the color of dried mustard. He pled guilty to second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and violations of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. His voice didn't shake. Miller, in a separate hearing, took his own plea: conspiracy, evidence tampering, aiding and abetting. His lawyer tried to paint him as a man blinded by loyalty, but the judge didn't bite. When sentencing came, Cam got life with the possibility of parole at 78. Miller got a term so long it might as well have been forever. Daniel didn't stay for the cameras outside. He slipped away down a side corridor, the echo of the gavel still in his ears. That night, Vega called. "You know the press is going to keep this alive for a while," she said. "Everyone loves a resolution to an old mystery. Just be ready, they're going to want you in front of a microphone." "I'm not a spokesperson," Daniel said. "Maybe not, but you're the reason this case is closed. That makes you part of the story, whether you like it or not." He thought about that for a long moment. The story was always about her. "I know," Vega said, "but the truth is about both of you now." The funeral was held under a sky so bright it felt almost cruel. The cemetery in Carlsbad was small, sand-colored headstones, mesquite casting ragged shadows across the rows. Mara was buried next to their parents, the simple granite marker reading, "Mara Rourke, beloved daughter and sister, the earth kept her secret, but heaven has her soul." Daniel stood at the grave long after the others had gone. In his hand was a trilobite fossil he'd bought from a reputable dealer in Santa Fe. No black market, no secrecy. He set it gently on the fresh earth. "She'd have loved this one," a voice said behind him. He turned to see Abby Sloan clutching a single sunflower. She looked uncertain, almost apologetic. "I didn't know if I should come." "You were part of finding her," Daniel said. "I'm glad you did." She set the flower down, brushing her fingers across the stone. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I used to read about cold cases and think they were just stories. Now I know they're more like bruises. You press, they hurt." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes you have to press anyway." They stood in silence until the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the rows. Back in Truth or Consequences, the house felt different. Less like a shrine, more like a room you could walk into without feeling you were trespassing on memory. He boxed up some of Mara's geology books for the university library, keeping only the field notebooks. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table with the last one she'd ever written in. October 27, 2003. The words were the same as the first time he'd read them in her bedroom, but now they carried the weight of everything that had followed. Feels like a secret whisper in the rock. He traced the sentence with his finger. I heard you, he said softly. Vega called once more before he left town for good. Officially, the case file is closed, she said. Unofficially, there's still a lot we won't ever know. What exactly they took, where it went, but that's for another division. You've done your part. He looked out the window at the desert evening, the sky a wide band of gold. It doesn't feel like a clean ending. Clean endings are for novels, Vega said. This is as close as it gets. After they hung up, Daniel stepped outside. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of creosote. Somewhere out beyond the darkening hills was the cave, its chambers silent now, its secrets sealed in official evidence bags. For the first time in 2 decades, he didn't feel pulled there. The door was shut. He locked the house for the last time, slid the key into an envelope for the realtor, and set it on the counter. Then he walked out into the evening, the horizon open ahead of him. The morning Daniel left Truth or Consequences. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that promised heat before noon. He had packed the last box into the back of his truck the night before: clothes, a few books, the trilobite paperweight he'd kept from Mara's collection. The rest he'd either given away or left for the realtor to deal with. He stood in the living room a final time, the air carrying that faint, familiar scent of dry plaster and sun-baked wood. Mara's old bedroom door was open. The shelves where her rock samples had been were bare now, the maps taken down, the curtains drawn back. It didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a room waiting to be used again. He stepped out onto the porch, locking the door behind him. The key felt lighter in his hand than he expected. He slid it into an envelope for the realtor, scrawled Rourke Final on the front, and set it on the small table by the door. As he started down the steps, a voice called from the sidewalk. Heading out, it was Abby Sloan, wearing jeans, a white t-shirt, and a nervous smile. She carried a travel mug and a manila folder. Yeah, Daniel said. Time to let the place go. She walked closer, holding out the folder. I thought you might want these before you left. I made copies of every page from that topo survey and the H11 project report. Figured maybe you'd want your own set, just in case. He took the folder, surprised at the lump in his throat. Thanks, Abby, you've done more than you realize. I didn't do much, she said, looking down. You did the heavy lifting. Then she looked up at him, her gaze steady. Do you feel like you've got what you came for? Daniel thought about the question for a long moment. I came for the truth, I got it, but the truth isn't clean, it's jagged, cuts when you hold it. Abby nodded. Yeah, it does that. On his way out of town, Daniel stopped at the cemetery one last time. The desert sun was already pushing down hard, the light so sharp it made the marble headstones look like they'd been carved from ice. He knelt at Mara's grave. The trilobite fossil he'd placed there 2 weeks earlier was still on top of the soil, the ridges of its shell catching the morning light. He reached out and touched it with his fingertips. They can't twist you anymore, he said softly. They can't make you into a rumor or a cautionary tale. You're whole again. He stayed there a few more minutes, then stood, brushing the dust from his jeans. 2 days later, back in Denver, he found himself on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights pulse against the dark. The phone on the table beside him buzzed. It was Special Agent Vega. Just wanted to let you know, she said. The fossil chamber's been sealed again, but this time for the right reasons. Official safety measures. No one's going to use it for anything else. Daniel let out a slow breath. Good. We also confirmed the fossils that were missing. Some were sold to private collectors years ago. The DOJ's going after them now. Might take a while. Justice moves slow, Daniel said. Sometimes, Vega replied, but it moves. She paused. You ever think about going into this line of work? You've got the persistence. He smiled faintly. I'm better at building things than breaking them apart. Maybe, she said, but you're one of the few who can do both. After they hung up, Daniel sat in the quiet for a long time. Weeks later, an invitation arrived in the mail. The National Park Service was holding a ceremony to honor those who'd helped bring closure to historic cases. His name was on the program. He almost didn't go. but in the end he drove back to New Mexico, this time without the weight of unfinished business. The ceremony was small, folding chairs set up on the overlook above the natural entrance, a handful of rangers in uniform, local press. Vega was there along with Abby, who waved when she saw him. When his name was called, Daniel stepped up to the podium. He looked out over the desert, the sun painting the limestone ridges gold. The mouth of the cave yawned below, dark and quiet. "I'm not a ranger or a detective," he began. "I'm just someone who lost a sister here. For years I thought that loss was a locked door. I stood in front of it, hoping it would open on its own. It never did. I had to force it open, and what I found on the other side wasn't peace, it was the truth, and the truth was hard. But it was also the only way to stop living in the hallway outside that door." He let his gaze sweep the small crowd. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that closure isn't an ending, it's a place to start again." When he stepped away from the podium, Abby squeezed his arm. "She'd be proud," she said. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove out past the park, past the turnoffs and the roadside stands selling pecan brittle and postcards. He pulled over at a bluff where you could see the entire spread of the desert, flat and endless, the horizon hazy in the distance. He stood there a long time, the wind pushing at his jacket, the heat rising from the stone. For the first time in 22 years, the silence around him didn't feel like absence. It felt like space, room to move, room to breathe. When he finally turned back toward the truck, he didn't look over his shoulder. The cave could keep its darkness. He had carried enough of it. There was still grief, there always would be, but it no longer had the power to stop him. He had walked into the heart of the earth and come back with his sister's truth, and in doing that, he had reclaimed his own life. The road stretched out ahead, long and open, and Daniel Rourke drove toward it without hesitation.